we really recognised the need to sequence the virus from a very early point, perhaps March 2020, because it's not a question if the virus will change, it's a question of when it will change. So we set up a network of sequencing labs across the country, and that's really enabled us to sequence these 500,000 genomes in the last 15 or 18 months or so.
Hello, welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, Director of Cambridge Forum, and today we have the last programme in our transformation series, which has been looking at the ways in which COVID has acted as an agent of change in our lives. Today's programme is going to be looking at the silver linings, examining the positive and perhaps more subtle beneficial effects that the pandemic has had on various aspects of life. In asking, has the pandemic made the world better? We will consider the innovations in science and technology, which have accelerated beyond all expectations in the last 18 months. In addition to these, we've seen changes in our behaviour and habits, some of which were very positive, like more quality time spent with our kids, exercising in home gyms that we rigged in our garages, exploring gardening for the first time, taking walks in nature, learning a new language, or even picking up that instrument and taking lessons online. Zoom allowed us to interact with colleagues and friends all over the world. It kept families in touch across continents and showed us new ways to work and collaborate. Most of us have heard of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but who has heard of the flip side? Well, post-traumatic growth, unexpected spiritual growth, a deeper sense of purpose or sense of gratitude will likely occur in 10% of the population. So all is not gloom and doom. Representing some of the different areas in which we can see proof of post-pandemic progress, we have three speakers joining us today, one from North Carolina and two transatlantically, thanks to technology. Professor Sharon Peacock is a microbiologist at the University of Cambridge, where she is founding director of COVID-19 Genomics UK Consortium, COG UK for short. And COG UK has pioneered the use of large-scale, rapid, whole genome sequencing of the COVID virus and its multiple variants. Mapping over 500,000 genomes has been vital to informing the public health response and vaccine development. Dr. Amy Canevello is a psychologist at UNC Charlotte, where she studies PTG, post-traumatic growth, looking at close relationships and trauma to understand how people attain optimal functioning even under adverse circumstances. And finally, Douglas Alexander is joining us from Glasgow, where he wears multiple hats. He's former UK Shadow Foreign Secretary, and when not advising U2's Bono on African investments and development, he's a senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center on the Future of Democracy project. Welcome to all three of you. You had previously worked on sequencing in food poisoning pathogens and Ebola in 2015. How was this different, and why were you able to work so much more quickly?
Yeah, well, I think that there's a few reasons actually why we can be quick. I think what we had to do was we had a past track record over the last 10 years of really refining our ability to do sequencing. And so we were able to turn on the tap quite quickly, certainly in the UK and elsewhere. We could start to sequence, but one of the big differences to the past is we've had to do this at massive scale. So, if we're sequencing Ebola or if we're sequencing foodborne pathogens, the numbers just don't equate to what we're doing at the moment. So, a big difference for us was the scale we needed to do sequencing and all of the analysis that entails. But the other thing is that we need to find out the results of that sequencing pretty jolly quickly, because if there's a new variant coming into the country and it's spreading, we need to know as soon as possible. So we need that data really, really fast. There's no time to lose. And I think that both the scale and the speed is what is really different. It feels very different to me this time round compared with previously. Now, it's always important to get the information, but there has been real pressure on us to get the data out, and quite right too, actually.
You told me that in 2001, it would have cost £500,000 to sequence and 18 months to sequence one genome.
Yes, just one.
What is it, the production cost and speed like in 2021?
Well, fortunately, it's a lot quicker. So, you know, one E. coli genome, that's a sort of bacterium that lives in your gut, would have cost £500,000 and 18 months. Right now, in terms of speed, it's very easy to sequence a genome within a day. It's easy to sequence very many genomes, thousands of genomes on one machine in a day. In terms of the cost, it depends how many genomes you're sequencing at one time. If you sequence a lot at one time, it gets very cheap. But you know, one genome costs roughly between $55 to $200 to do, and the higher scale you do, the cheaper it becomes. So there's been a staggering reduction in cost and time, actually, compared to, you know, the turn of the century, and that again is a scientific triumph that certainly I will be treasuring and thinking about how to use going forward into future threats to our health.
So talking about these beneficial silver lining effects, during the COVID crisis, you said that scientific problem solving was helped by international collaborations and cross-fertilization of different disciplines, perhaps maybe in a new way, which brought people together. Can you explain a bit about that? And I know the UK, share your data on the cloud, and it's freely accessible. Is this true of all countries? Are they all sharing their information as freely?
Yeah, the overwhelming majority of countries share their data freely. The US share their genomes, their viral genomes, and we do. Many countries do. A tiny minority may not do. And it's this database called GISAID. It's a kind of an open access database, and that allows really global sharing. I think there's two other things to say. First of all, you know, scientists are generally quite competitive on the whole. You know, they like to get their data and they like to analyze it until it's perfect, and then they write it into a paper and that goes into a journal, and that can take several years, and you don't release your data necessarily until you've done what you need to. But actually, scientists have been willing to share their data, their knowledge, their methods immediately. So you know, it's quite extraordinary, but people put the data out there for everyone to see, and you know, before you've even analysed it, because that's the right thing to do actually right now. And one hopes that going forward that we can carry that philosophy forward. I've also seen lots of different disciplines coming together. So people who are experts in the virus or in the immune system or in the genetics or in the evolution, all coming together to try and actually make a kind of a better job of understanding the virus than they could in their kind of separate silos. And again, I really hope that that we continue that paradigm of really working across the disciplines, because it has made a big difference actually during the pandemic, bringing all of those minds together to understand the virus and better manage the pandemic.
Well, that's very, by the way, I know you're not going to say this, but Sharon actually got a CBE from the Queen for her work doing this. So it's no small task that she's been about for several years, correct? You've been working.
Yes, I did. Yes. In fact, my work was for genomics and antibiotic resistance in 2015, I think. So so I'm grateful to her. But I mean, it's just an absolute honor and a privilege for me to be able to use what I know to try and help other people. And genome sequencing has really come into its own in a way that people didn't really hear about a couple of years ago. And I'm grateful that we can do something to help.
It's true. We all know about DNA and RNA, and we're all quite sort of savvy with these terms that, you know, 2 years ago we wouldn't have had any clue about, correct? So.
No, we've all become biologists, which I think is a good thing. Well, I would say that, wouldn't I? But you know, I love it when I see people on social media, you know, small children saying, "I want to be a scientist because it's so interesting," and I just think, yes, come and be a scientist because it is really interesting. So, Mary, you might disagree because you're in a different field, but I think that science, you know, people, I think that they really have captured their imagination, and you know, people are thinking that's a career for me. So it's a fascinating thing to do.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I'm surrounded by scientists actually in my family, but I like very much it's gotten to be very attractive. They actually can see the efficacy of the work in a very direct way. It's not some remote thing in a laboratory anymore. It's something that affects your life in every day, you know. So I think it's brought science to the fore in a good way. So I know that Harvard said that more people are signing up for public health now than they've ever had in the last year, which is great.
Brilliant news.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to take a complete switch now. Thank you, Sharon. We're going to go across to Dr. Amy Canevello in Charlotte, North Carolina. Hi, Amy. So Amy's a health psychologist at UNC, where she works in the field of post-traumatic growth. And that's a term that was coined at your university by two of the psychologists there. And she looks at close relationships to see how trauma affects people's functioning, even under adverse conditions. So this idea that great growth can come from suffering is a very ancient one. I know there's a biblical quote in Romans that says, suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope, which I'm not sure about that, but it's a nice idea. So traditionally, post-traumatic growth has been seen while studying the effects of trauma on veterans, refugees, prisoners of war, and the bereaved. And I think you discovered some amazing things when you were dealing with populations of prisoners of war that had been up to 9 years in prisons in North Vietnam. And some of them came back kind of transformed by the trauma and led better lives with regard to their physical and emotional health, their quality of relationships, and sense of satisfaction in life. So how do you measure this? And is there a way to predict who will experience this growth?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me. This is really an interesting panel. So how do you experience post-traumatic growth? So what happens when people experience a trauma or a major stressor, at least the way that that Lawrence Calhoun and Rich Tedeschi, who are my colleagues at UNC Charlotte, who coined these ideas. What happens is traumas can be so sort of earth-shattering, right? That they disrupt your core beliefs about how the world works, right? Your beliefs about yourself, your beliefs about other people, your beliefs about fairness in the world, right? Just how the world operates. And once those beliefs have been shattered, that's part of the trauma, right? Is that I don't understand how to make sense of my world anymore. And so what we see happening with post-traumatic growth is that when people's worldviews have been just decimated, is they have to go through a process of putting their world back together in a way that can incorporate that traumatic event, right? So typically what we see is people, it can be a long process. It could be a short process. It kind of depends on the person and the trauma. But what you see is people will right after the trauma and for a period after that, they'll ruminate about the event, but it'll be almost uncontrollable, right? So there's symptoms that you typically associate with PTSD, right? So they can't stop thinking about it. They have flashbacks, right? There's these uncontrollable thoughts. What happens with PTG is that eventually these uncontrollable thoughts and ruminations, people can start to sort of make sense of things, and they start to deliberate and ruminate about that event in a more deliberate way, right? In a more controlled way, because they're able to sort of put those pieces back together in a way that now fits, right? Allows them to incorporate this traumatic thing that happened. And then that's when we see post-traumatic growth. Right. So we tend to see it in the people who are able to move from the uncontrollable rumination to the more deliberate rumination. That's more constructing that worldview, putting it back together. So
I was looking at the characteristics of that, which are very similar to sort of resilience, people that exhibit resilience, which is spirituality, new possibilities, gratitude, deeper relationships, and some have a boost in their physical strength.
Yeah, so post-traumatic growth specifically is basically positive changes that people experience as a result of going through this major crisis or traumatic event. And so we tend to see post-traumatic growth in 5 general areas. So it's, when you go through this process, people might be more likely to see new possibilities, right, for their lives, that there are opportunities that they can see that they weren't able to see before. We see changes in relationships with others. So this can be that they develop closer relationships with specific people. It can also be that they just have an increased sense of connection with other people who are suffering, particularly suffering in ways that are similar to their own. We see increases.
So sort of growth in empathy.
Sort of, yeah. We also see changes in a sense of personal strength, right? If I went through this really traumatic experience and came out on the other side, then I can do a lot. I'm a lot stronger than I thought I was. Another area is just in appreciation for life in general, because a lot of times, you know, in clinical psychology, they define trauma as being something where you have come close to death, or you know, you're right up on the edge of like physical harm or harm to someone else close to you. So what you can also tend to see is an appreciation for life, because I now realize how fragile life is, right? And I can just appreciate it more. And we also see changes in spirituality and religiosity. So it can be either a deepening of spiritual life in some way, or it can be a complete change in a belief system. So these changes that we see tend to fall in these categories, but what that looks like isn't always the same for everybody, right? It's going to be different depending on just how people process information and what's important to them.
So it's probably a bit early because it's still ongoing in many parts of the world. I mean, it hasn't gone away anywhere, but some places it's still raging. So one wouldn't expect to see signs of this, perhaps, unless you've had a near-death experience and a recovery and suddenly realized that you were, you know, about to snuff it.
Yeah.
So is there any way that you can help nurture these things?
Yeah. So one thing to remember is maybe I didn't make that clear earlier, is that in clinical psychology, they define traumas in a very specific way, and that's because we have to in clinical psychology. But even Dr. Tedeschi and Dr. Calhoun talked about that they wish they hadn't called it post-traumatic growth, because we find these kinds of processes happening even under just very stressful circumstances. Right. So it doesn't have to be, I came close to death. It can be, I just experienced something that was really, really difficult and sort of changed my view of how I see the world. So it can be just major life stressors, like going through a divorce, right? Or having or somebody gets, I don't know, get cancer. I guess that's closer to the death thing, but it doesn't have to be these really, really traumatic things. So it's actually not out of the realm of possibility that because of all of the disruption that we've seen over the last 15 months, that we're going to see a lot more trauma or trauma responses, right? These responses to very stressful events, that they're going to be much more common than you might think. So I was just for this, I was reading a piece from a woman in Australia who was talking about, and she had written that piece I think it was April or May of last year. So it was early on in the pandemic. Australia had shut down, right? They didn't have any cases, but she was talking about, they had done some national surveys, and the survey data suggested that people were really stressed. Just being under lockdown, right, was really, people were experiencing a lot of anxiety. They were experiencing a lot of loneliness. And so they were having these stress responses, right, to the pandemic, even though they weren't experiencing the pandemic directly. So I think the potential consequences of the pandemic for people's mental health is much more broad than we think about it, particularly with respect to stress and trauma responses. But that also leaves the possibility for people to experience post-traumatic growth. Right. So another thing to remember about post-traumatic growth is that it's not a dichotomy. So it's not an all or nothing thing, right? It's not a diagnosis. that we have. So it can be, you can experience no growth at all, or you can experience tremendous growth, or you can lie on a continuum in between. And so it's important to remember that it's not, that people have tried to estimate how much quote unquote growth, how many people experience post-traumatic growth, but it's not necessarily accounting for people who are experiencing lower levels of growth. So that's also a possibility. So the things that we can do to promote PTG are things that kind of get you from that rumination that's kind of uncontrollable, right, to more deliberate rumination. And it just includes things like, being mindful, right? Practicing mindfulness, and being aware of your thoughts and how you're experiencing things, and then really thinking through them, right? Sort of a meta awareness of your internal experience, I think could help you.
Well, I think a lot of people that they interviewed, I read a lot of interviews with people that had adopted various habits, new habits, exercising, growing things for the first time, walking in nature, because it was one of the few things you could do if you were lucky. And they're not going to change those things. They've got a new awareness. So in a way, that's a form of growth, personal growth.
Yeah.
That they're not going to give up on that because they've realized it actually has a great value to their mental health, their general mental health.
Yeah.
So I think hopefully we'll be changed in some good ways.
Yes.
After we get through the other side of this.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
So we're going to take another giant leap. A few weeks ago, The Economist did a very interesting piece on international negotiation and diplomacy, which I read, which postulated the idea that diplomacy had actually accelerated and improved during the pandemic. One UN envoy said, "We are a lot better off now because of COVID in terms of diplomacy and mediation. We've been forced to think more carefully about how we do our jobs. And it's a huge seismic change to the way we do business." Well, this is in no small part due to having to use Zoom technology. And someone who knows all about the pluses and the pitfalls of long distance Zooms is our third guest, Douglas Alexander. Welcome, Douglas.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
So, as an international negotiator, you have had a unique seat at the global circus. What trends or developments did you witness that gave you reason for hope during this uncertain and very difficult time with regard to global dialogue?
Well, let me first of all not just thank the technologists who created Zoom, but the Cambridge Forum for the chance to be with this global gathering this evening. And it really would be remiss of me to say anything other than thank you to start with to Sharon and to her colleagues in the scientific community who have been inspirational in the cooperation that they have shown across international borders during a time of great worry and anxiety for many billions of us around this planet. Anybody who aspires to be a scientist, I think, could have found many reasons to be inspired by the extraordinary collaboration and innovation that we've seen from the scientific community. But I think in terms of your broader question about reasons to feel optimistic, I think often we think of human beings as being thinking beings that have emotions. And I actually think a wiser way to understand the human condition is that we're emotional beings who have thoughts. So let's start with the shared emotions that many billions of us around the planet have experienced over the last 16 to 18 months. And I think one grounds for optimism is actually the shared experience of vulnerability that many of us, indeed all of us, have felt over that traumatic period for us. A sense not just that we are experiencing something in common with the 7 billion or so fellow citizens on this planet, but actually a deeper lesson that there's no individual salvation from the collective challenge of this virus. We can't privatize or isolate ourselves to safety. None of us are ultimately going to be safe until all of us are safe. And in that sense, in a world and in a politics that all too easily has been divided and polarized in recent years, the starting point for my optimism is a sense that we've had a shared experience. But that is contingent as an answer to you on the leadership in the latter stages of the pandemic and in the years following the pandemic, creating a post-crisis common sense that not only offers an accurate and truthful account of what we've experienced, but charts a course forward for our individual nations and for our global community. And in that sense, I'm speaking to you from the United Kingdom, from here in Glasgow. There was a lot of talk at the beginning of this pandemic here in the United Kingdom of the Blitz spirit. One of the afflictions of the British people is a tendency to constantly hark back to the Second World War, to our finest hour when we stood alone on this continent of Europe in the face of the threat of Nazism and fascism. But actually, the reason I draw that analogy is not just the trite historical parallel, but actually the fact that in 1940, Winston Churchill became the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in extraordinarily difficult circumstances, but managed to change the shared consciousness of the nation by his brilliance as a storyteller. When he became the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, as the Blitz bombs were still falling on London, he didn't pretend that it was going to be easy. He promised blood, sweat, toil, and tears. He didn't deny the scale of the challenge that the country faced, but by the brilliance and eloquence of his language and his capacity to make sense of what the country was experiencing, he not only lifted the spirits of the nation, but actually charted a way forward. That to me still feels like the right test for our political leaders, which is, can they offer a truthful and candid account of what we've experienced? And can they then chart a way forward by offering not just a changed mindset, but also choosing a different future? And in that sense, I think there are grounds for cautious optimism that as we come through this pandemic, we actually do have the opportunity for a reset, not just in the individual lifestyles that you were describing, Mary, but also collectively and internationally. We've learned that actually we must work together in the face of a common threat. I think that's a powerful lesson that will be useful in global public health, but in the face of challenges like climate change, global security, global prosperity in the years and decades to come.
Well, you said a lot of good things there, Douglas. I think there were certain big things that had to be postponed or delayed, such as the climate conference that you're alluding to. Was it COP26?
That's right.
So do you think the global crisis galvanized common goals, or were there certain players, like apparently Russia will refuses to do virtual Security Council meetings? So
yes, if we take the Security Council first, the Security Council has now resumed face-to-face meetings in the UN headquarters in New York. That started just towards the end of May. And prior to that, since the preceding October, there had been virtual meetings as we saw the advent of the second wave in North America and globally. But truthfully, it's not a new story that Russia would choose to potentially act and use its veto in a way that other countries within the Security Council would regard as being contrary to their interests. So if you like, there might be a different pretext for Russia's actions, but I don't think it would be possible to attribute that exclusively to the pandemic. I do think if you look at the climate conference here in Glasgow, we're looking forward to a gathering of all of the nations of the world in November, the first 2 weeks of November, so just in about 6 months' time, when we will be seeking to reach international agreement on the threat of climate change internationally. That conference was supposed to happen not this coming November, but last November. And you're right to recognise that that conference was postponed for 12 months. The judgment of the British government and indeed the Italian government, who are the joint hosts of that COP26, as it's called, the Conference of the Parties, the 26th meeting of that conference, was that they were more likely to secure ambitious outcomes if delegates were able to meet face-to-face. And if the meeting was conducted exclusively on Zoom, it would certainly be possible to have the international meeting, but it made more likely a low ambition rather than a high ambition outcome to the conference. So in that sense, we will discover in about the second week of November whether the decision to delay that conference on climate change has been vindicated by a successful, ambitious series of conclusions, or whether we draw a different lesson. So I would argue, certainly, as the Economist piece that you referred to suggests, with goodwill and commitment, the new technology that we've all learned to use over the last 18 months need not be an insuperable barrier, both to international understanding and to international action. What is required is the shared experience, the political leadership, and the shared commitment to try and make the world better in the future than it's been in the most recent years.
So let's getting down to just the brass tacks now. What are the hurdles when you've got hundreds of people in a Zoom conference like the UN? I can't even imagine. And how do you stop how do you do the logistics of it? And how do you get away with certain nations perhaps dominating the proceedings? Do you think that Zoom is actually more equitable in some ways than direct dialogue, or?
Truthfully, Zoom is a very vertical medium. And the great strength of most negotiations is that they are horizontal. And in that sense, there's been required to be great statecraft, albeit using very modern technology, by those convening these conferences to try and ensure that there is equitable participation. Because, Mary, you're easily the most powerful person on this call because you wield the mute button as the chair of the event. And that is as true in international negotiations as it is in a meeting of the Cambridge Forum. And in that sense, you have to act very carefully in these negotiations to stop individual countries feeling excluded. And sometimes, as we've seen in the climate negotiations, something as basic as, is your country suffering power outages, or are the internet connections in your country very weak, can dictate whether countries feel that they're able to fully participate in the negotiations. So one of the things that bedeviled the early stages of these climate conversations was some of the small island nations in the Pacific saying that, unable to attend face-to-face meetings as they were at a structural disadvantage when they were being asked to join calls very late at night or very early in the morning. Delegates from South Africa and other countries were raising concerns over the reliability of their internet connections. So there's been a need for deft statesmanship and statecraft from those convening the conferences. The British and the Italian governments convening the COP on climate change that's taking place in November. The Chinese government are convening a COP on biodiversity earlier this year. But I don't think, again, that the technology is insuperable. There are ways that we can work together to overcome it. And it certainly removed a lot of the friction that accompanies delegations traveling very many miles for individual meetings. I personally think it's very unlikely we will see a resumption of the level of business travel that we saw before this pandemic. The idea that you would hop on a plane across the Atlantic for a single dinner or a single lunch certainly wasn't a privilege enjoyed by many people, but there were some business people who did that as a matter of course. I think both the constraints on business travel budgets and the shared habits we've all acquired over the last 18 months means that actually there will be quite permanent changes, not just in the way international business is conducted, but also the way international diplomacy is conducted as well.
So you are involved in this Future of Diplomacy project at the Belfer School. So how did you actually manage to do that? I mean, did it lend itself, having the Zoom, to your students being all over the world and you being in one place and then being in another, or did it demonstrate the actual challenges of diplomacy?
No, I think it was a very positive lesson, as your question suggested. Firstly, one of the great privileges of being a senior fellow in the Belfer Centre is that the Kennedy School within Harvard, in which the Belfer Centre is based, is no longer really an American university. It's an extraordinarily international institution that is deeply committed and anchored in Cambridge and Massachusetts, but has been for many decades a genuinely international cohort of students. So if you like, the traditional pattern would be that I, as a senior fellow, would travel across the Atlantic for a certain number of days every semester and engage in graduate seminars or masterclasses or large school teaching. In fact, of necessity, we found that most of our students returned home, very often to their parents, in every corner of the earth when the pandemic struck a year ago in March. And then we acquired new habits like everybody else very quickly. So actually, my experience over the last 18 months in some ways embodies that broader trend that I was talking about, that there's proved to be not an absence of technology, but an absence of imagination that informed how we worked before the pandemic. And actually, whether it is one-to-one tutorials, whether it is seminars, whether it is larger webinars, we, like many other institutions, have developed new habits that, frankly, I think will stay with us long after this terrible pandemic has passed.
Well, you bring up a lot of good points. We've got some questions coming in, which I'm going to put forth. But just before I'm doing that, I wondered if each of you would think about something that you will remember post-pandemic that you want to keep, or alternatively want to forget. So was there something a pearl that you took away from this experience that you can maybe think of while we're bringing up these questions? This is a question for Sharon about the human genome prompting people to act collectively in response to a threat. Do you think the human genome is capable of responding collectively to climate change, even if we as a community are inadequately able to do this? That's a difficult question.
I have to come off mute. It's a pity I have to come off mute. It's a pretty tough question, but I'm going to come off mute anyway. That's a really interesting question. Thank you for posing that. I mean, at the end of the day, everything we do and are, every kind of muscle and sinew in our body is really encoded by the human genome. So everything we do in our hair color, etc., is coded by that. But actually, once we're born and we are who we are, much of our behavior is also shaped by everything that's going on around us. And so there's this tension between, is something that you're doing, encoded in your genome and it's hardwired, or is it something that actually is a combination of that plus your environment? And this comes back to this kind of nature and nurture argument. So I would suggest that the way we responded to the pandemic has largely been a collective social response to the requests that we've had around hands, face, space, fresh air. We've all had to get used to very different ways of living in terms of our liberties, etc., and wearing a mask. These are things we never used to do before. And personally, I think that comes down to our environment rather than our genome, and adapting to our social situation. And I'm quite sure that Amy is much more qualified to speak about the psychology of this. But my suspicion is that the human genome has had very little to do with that. Although, of course, the human genome is really likely to be important in the way we then respond if we have COVID-19. So, do we have no symptoms? Do we have quite severe symptoms? Do we go on to get long COVID? So for me, the role of the human genome in this pandemic is really revolving around how we respond to the disease and how rapidly we recover. And if we do recover, it's certainly got a role.
I think the fact that we had to, it was a life or death situation, showed what could be done in 18 months. And I wish we could create the same urgency with the climate crisis without us all dropping off the West Coast, which, the heat here today is 97 degrees and it's 100 degrees on the West Coast and more. So this is a taste of what's to come. So I just wonder what more we need as a kind of a precursor to get us to act. And that's just a random, anyone can comment on that. Douglas, do you have any thoughts on that?
I suppose I take a more optimistic view, which is, I remember reading in journal after journal the length of time it took to develop vaccines in the 1950s and 60s and 70s and 80s. And I hope one of the lessons that we learn as we look ahead to climate change, which, if you want to understand the difference from the pandemic, is that there is no peak climate change. It is a non-linear progression. And in a way that you hit peak pandemic, alas, we won't hit peak climate change unless we address it. But the more optimistic construction is, we've learned that as a world, we can do hard things together. And in that sense, the extraordinary scientific innovation is only going to be one of the components that we need to tackle dangerous climate change. We're going to have to see significant shifts in the market, significant leadership by government, and significant actions by individual citizens. But on the other hand, I think that the learning out of this pandemic potentially is what seemed in the early stages of the pandemic to be an almost nightmarishly overwhelming threat has been met and mastered by the brilliance of humankind. And that seems to me to be a good lesson to take forward.
I hope you're right, Douglas. I hope you're right. Amy, there's a couple of questions, both sort of psychological. One you maybe don't have an answer to. Someone's asked, I think those who took up walking, etc. a year ago will soon go back to their old habits. Are we making these assessments too soon? And then someone else said, do you think that those with PTSD from other sources might be experiencing this pandemic in a way that they are better prepared for the stress? Interesting.
Wow. Okay. So to answer the first question, that's kind of one of the $1 million questions in health psychology, right? Is how do you get people to maintain changes, particularly after so once things kind of settle down, right, and we get back to the normal sort of grind of life. I don't know that I can answer that question. There are lots of things to think about. I think we know some things about what might increase the likelihood of people keeping those habits, right? Because that's really what they are, is habits. And I'm not an expert on habits, but the little that I know suggests that if you've figured out a way to just make it part of your life, right, you're much more likely to keep doing those things. I think the big question here is how much are people going to go back to the mindset that they had previously, right? So that's a slightly different question, and it's a big question. The other question about PTSD and being prepared, sort of preparing people for this, I don't know that that's necessarily the case, right? So, post-traumatic growth and post-traumatic stress go hand in hand. They go together. They're positively related. So, what we typically find in our research is that people who experience post-traumatic growth are also experiencing post-traumatic stress. And just because you've experienced one stressor does not necessarily make you better prepared for another stressor. And I think that might be particularly so. Oh, I'm sorry. That might be particularly so if it's a different kind of stressor. And this last year and change has been a very different kind of stressor compared to what we've seen previously. So it's kind of a tricky idea that I don't know that would necessarily play out that way.
Okay, going back to the previous question I put to you, someone who's actually asked, what was the greatest virtual program that you attended in the past 18 months, each of you? That's kind of interesting. Puts you on the spot. Was there any that you remembered enjoying or learning anything from? A dull silence met the trio.
I've been at lots of dull Zoom meetings, I have to admit. But one Harvard seminar that will live long in my memory was with African students and African leaders about the impact of the pandemic on the continent. Because actually what rapidly emerged was the degree of cooperation and understanding between nations in Africa was significantly better at that stage than amongst the nations in Europe, partly because of the experience of Ebola, partly because of the establishment of an African CDC, Center for Disease Control, that the seminar rapidly turned into a teaching session whereby these African students and African leaders were really tutoring and advising European countries, the United Kingdom included, which at that stage was still struggling to find our footing. So that's certainly one online meeting that I will remember for a long time.
Any others? No.
I think, Mary, for me, it wasn't so much a sort of virtual program, but it was a Zoom call that really sticks in my mind. So I was on a Zoom call with a country which had a very high rate of COVID-19, was really struggling with its with access to medical care and so on. And I think that for me, it was a moment when you realize the fragility of life and also the importance of healthcare, universal healthcare. And so it was the flip side for me that it really brought it home to me that in some parts of the world, the response to COVID has been really, really tough for its people. And it made it much more tangible. So you can see this on TV and in papers, but actually when you hear people who are dealing with it day to day, you just go, wow. So, we've really got to get our vaccines right. We've got to get our sequencing right because this is so serious. So that was a very kind of salutary moment for me.
Amy?
I don't know that, I also don't know that I had a moment, but I think it has struck me how everything, not everything, but a lot of things going virtual and going online has expanded the possibilities in terms of who has access to information and who has access to what, right? So I have been able to attend conferences that I never usually attend because they're either international or not timed right. We've learned a lot about how to change how we navigate our worlds and in ways that allow other people to access them, right? So I have students who who would maybe struggle with coming to campus and doing all of things, but if you can make your classes online or have students have access to the faculty or me have access to my doctor online, then it just widens the possibilities in terms of I have a family member who had a pretty serious accident during COVID and couldn't be sent to the burn center that was 8 hours away, but they did Zoom calls, which was really, really helpful, right? So I think it has sort of it's broadened the possibilities and sort of changed how we think about problem solving and inclusivity, I think, in interesting ways.
That's good. I have to say that from my perspective, just doing this program, it's been marvelous because I would never have you three people all have a dialogue on Zoom. I mean, to get you to come to Cambridge with your busy lives across the Atlantic, and it's so powerful and enriching to get all these different views from different parts of the world. I've just found it to be tremendously fertile in terms of cross-referencing thinking. And I think it's marvelous that when people don't mind staying up late, which I appreciate you guys, we can have great conversations. So,
Mary, could I possibly just make one additional point, which is rightly we've emphasized in this call how powerful Zoom is and the virtual world. I also think there's a separate lesson, which is really about the importance of each other as human beings. Let me share a personal experience. My parents have both been in a care home throughout the entirety of the pandemic. And the work that those care workers have been doing in circumstances where myself and my sisters were unable to visit my parents has been literally priceless. There is nothing that we could pay those staff that recognizes and reflects accurately the degree of gratitude that we as a family feel for the care that they've shown my parents. And yet the irony is those staff members are paid the minimum wage here in the United Kingdom. And actually, I think we've had a huge lesson in who genuinely are the essential workers on whom all the rest of us rely. Whether those are healthcare workers, whether those are bus drivers, whether those are shelf stackers in our supermarkets, whether those are the men and women who pick up our rubbish in the streets. And in that sense, one of the other things that I hope is a very kind of low-tech, high-touch understanding, which is to invert a sense of who really matters in society. Certainly here in the United Kingdom, we've all discovered quite how reliant we are on some of the most poorly paid workers in society who, by the sweat of their brow and the commitment that they show to their jobs, allow our modern societies to function. And that's not got very much to do with Zoom, but I really, really hope that people learn that lesson, because incidentally, those have been the workers who have been putting themselves most at threat for the rest of us, while someone like myself has had the privilege actually of joining endless Zoom calls on the internet while they've been going out to work and putting themselves in circumstances of vulnerability every day.
I think I couldn't agree more with you. I think that's a tremendous point. And I was amazed how quickly the word essential in front of those workers went back to low paid. In the articles that I've been reading in the last couple of months, we can't get people to do the low paid work now in restaurants. Well, guess what? Suddenly people realized that their lives were pretty awful and conditions and treatment was pretty abysmal, and maybe they could do something else. So they've had a tremendous problem on the East Coast filling service positions in restaurants and other types of work. So it should make us all, as you say, really appreciate how reliant and how important those people are, and that they should be paid more. So kudos, Douglas, for you for mentioning that. So we're actually got less than 5 minutes. Very quickly, would you say the pandemic has made us, you said more human, perhaps closer and more human on the whole? Anyone?
For me, I would say, and this comes back to kind of my post-pandemic Pearl, for me, it's brought it home to me how precious family and friends are, and human contact. And so today I went out at lunchtime and I had a cup of coffee with a friend around the corner, and that actually, I would have taken that absolutely for granted 2 years ago. That was very, very special moment, and I really appreciated her company. So I hope that doesn't go away. I hope that doesn't wash out as we get back to normality. For me, that has made a big difference, that I do value family and friends and human contact. And I think it's going to have quite a lasting impact on the way that I make decisions about where I live and how I work in the future. So you were saying that people are making decisions about what they're going to do in their lives. I think it's going to affect us all, actually, in terms of how we make decisions about our future.
Amy?
Oh, there's so much to say there, right? I absolutely agree with the importance of relationships. I think people have, it took shutting down for people to slow down, right? And I started walking my dog during regular hours, and I met all my neighbors, right? They all know me. And now if I leave town, I get phone calls. Where are you? Are you okay? Right? So I think it has allowed people to just connect with others in a different way that may have a different meaning to them. I don't want to say it's more or less meaningful, but in a different way that I think is important for them.
Last word from you, Douglas.
Well, it's a word of agreement, both with Amy and with Sharon. As human beings, we are relational beings. We find ourselves in relationship with others. And if I'm honest, we've been incredibly successful at flattening the curve in certain countries, but all too often that's been at the cost of flattening ourselves. And speaking personally, I'm really looking forward to getting out in the world again, seeing family, seeing friends, and a lot of the casual encounters. I've managed to stay in touch with my closest family and my closest friends through Zoom and through telephone contact. But it's a long time since I've met that wider outer concentric circle of people who may not be my closest friends, but I enjoy seeing now and again. And in that sense, I think for many of us, it's been a flattening, diminishing experience, and we feel a bit depleted 16 or 17 months into this pandemic. So I think one of the reasons to be optimistic as this call comes to a conclusion is that there's a real chance that we can not just see and touch and be with each other, but actually draw a lot of energy and excitement from seeing people that we just haven't seen in a long time.
Well, all wonderful positive notes to end on there. Very pleased. I'd like to thank Amy and Douglas and Sharon for your time and your input and your wonderful comments, which should make us all feel pretty good, actually, about some of the more beneficial things that have happened in the world because of COVID, despite all the negative things that we've had to endure. So I'd like to thank you all for listening to Cambridge Forum's discussion, Has the Pandemic Made the World Better? Our guest speakers were Professor Sharon Peacock from the University of Cambridge, Dr. Amy Canevello from UNC Charlotte, and Douglas Alexander, who's with the Harvard Belfer Center Future of Diplomacy, who came to us from Glasgow.